coronavirus-themed edition of City Gallery Wellington's Book Club. Book Club is a long-running and proud feature of our events program. But of course tonight, we're not in the gallery. We're in our bubbles on the last night of lockdown at Alert Level 3 in Aotearoa. I'm Megan Dunn. I'm the recently appointed Head of Audience Engagement and Education at City Gallery Wellington's Book Club. I'm also an art writer and panellist tonight. I moot somewhat earnestly that one of the functions of art is to be a witness, and we are all witnesses of this moment in time. If we're lucky, we're just witnesses. Tonight, our panel will discuss some of the content the world has been reading and watching in the era of coronavirus. Let me hand over now to our wonderful chair, the prize-winning author Pip Adam, and our great panellists. Thank you for joining us. Thanks, Pip.
Kia ora, Megan. Thanks so much. I am very grateful to be here, and it's wonderful to be meeting with all of you here tonight. Tonight we are going to have a special edition of our book club, which is such a wonderful event, and we're going to be talking about two books. We are going to be talking about we're going to be talking about a book and a movie. We're going to be talking about Albert Camus' amazing book, The Plague, which was published in 1947. And we're also going to be talking about Steven Soderbergh's incredibly interesting, strange book, movie, Contagion. Graham, I can hear a little bit of feedback. Is that coming through to you too?
Yes, that's coming through a little. Possibly when Megan was speaking. It's not so much when you speak.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Graham. Hello, everyone. This is what it's like in the modern era. What I'm going to do to start off with is just ask John and Roosevelt to introduce themselves and just tell us a little bit about being here tonight. So, John, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, sure. Well, thanks very much for having me here, everyone. So, yeah, my name's John Summers, obviously. I guess I'm here because I wrote something recently for Newsroom about this book, The Plague, and the experience of reading it now and why we might read it now. I'm been writing for Newsroom and other publications over the last few years, places like North and South, and the spin-off about a range of topics. The Plague and this Albert Camus novel is what has brought me here this evening.
Awesome. It's so good to have you here, John. And Roosevelt, do you want to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about how things are going?
Kia ora, everyone. I'm Roosevelt, and a proud entrant in the hashtag credibility bookshelf trend. I'm here because we'll get into it, but I had not been consuming a lot of pandemic fiction until now. But my background, I guess, is I'm the founding editor of an arts and culture site called Pantograph Punch, and am currently the director of Satellites, which is a production house for events, exhibitions, performances, focused on, I guess, the contemporary experience of the Asian diaspora in Aotearoa.
Such an amazing project. It's just really exciting. And we're actually featuring some other articles tonight as well, and they are in the description below us. Below our box, there is a description. I feel like saying you should like and subscribe, but that's a little bit, I'm too old for that. So we are looking at 5 articles as well, tangential to these two main sort of items of culture. We're looking at a fantastic essay called You Treat Us Like We're the Virus by Vanessa Crofskey, The Pandemic as a Porthole by Arundhati Roy, The American Exception by Zadie Smith, Man Reads Plague During the Plague, which is by John Summers and is fantastic, and The Highs, the Lows, and the WTFs of the One World Together at Home, which is just a really funny article by Sam, which is just amazing. So I thought we could start with Contagion. I must admit that when I, all through watching this film, I was just thinking to myself, why did no one watch this movie and warn us? It just is so ridiculously prescient. And I was just thinking, John, in your essay, you say of works like The Plague that they are the animal entrails, the stars, the clairvoyant offering appointments at their home in an outer suburb. And I'm just wondering about, when you were reading The Plague, when you were watching Contagion rather, and I was just wondering about this idea of the future and just the relationship between Contagion and how things turned out. I wondered if you could just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. So I had that experience as well. I mean, it seemed, and there's a moment in this film where someone refers to social distancing, and I think that was as shocking as anything, because I don't recall ever having heard that phrase till we came to this time we're in now. But yeah, that's how accurate it is about some of those details. It's funny, isn't it? The kind of disaster movie seems to go in kind of trends, and I remember. In the 90s, I think was the last kind of big wave of them, and then it's kind of petered off as a thing. But I think we do kind of look to those for, when we're in a time like this when we have no idea what might happen next or where it's going. It's hard not to look to fictional portrayals for some sort of, even though they're fiction, for some, path or map or advice, if you like, on what might happen next.
Yeah.
It's kind of sorry, I lost my train there, but it is. I think Megan's mentioned in the material for this talk that The Plague, for instance, is sold, the Camus book sold, thousands copies worldwide right now, and Contagion has leaped to, I don't remember it coming out at all. I'd never seen it before, but now people are seeking it out and watching it, and I can only think that's why, because they want, we look to fiction for some sort of clue of what's going to happen.
People are apparently looking directly to the screenwriter Scott Z. Burns for advice on everything. Whether one person asked Scott, I think on Twitter, whether or not they should travel to Hong Kong or not at one point recently.
Is he giving advice?
I don't think he felt comfortable about giving health and safety advice. No, there's a great article on Vulture that I just quickly whizzed through tonight, speaking to Scott, because of all of the, increased interest in Contagion. It first came out in 2011, and I read this review today as well from that time, which ends on this sentence. Yet what's really scary in Contagion is how fast once humming airports and offices, homes and cities empty out when push comes to shove, comes to panic in the streets. And I was just like, wow. Yes, indeed. But it's funny how I'm sure I watched Contagion when it first came out, and it just kind of swept over me as though it was fiction. So it's interesting now that we turn to the screenwriter for facts. And indeed, part of the reason why it's so prescient is because he worked closely with two epidemiologists, one called Larry Brilliant. I mean, does it get better than that? And another man, Ian Upkin, and they wanted it to feel very real. So I think those first 15 minutes, it does feel like it gets its facts right. Although when I watched it in 2011 and it was doing a close-up of someone hopping onto a bus and a handle that someone was holding, I'm sure I just thought, drama. But now I look at those scenes and they're radioactive with everything that's happening that's real.
Yeah, it's so true. Roosevelt, talking about this idea of, confusion of sort of fact and fiction, I couldn't help thinking when I was watching Contagion that and I kept thinking of Vanessa Crofskey's essay, and this idea about how there had almost been this gearing towards the racism that took part. And there is a strange sort of focus on the USA, and I just wonder, do you have any thoughts about that, sort of thinking about Vanessa's essay at the same time? Yeah, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's funny. I actually rewatched Contagion last night. I watched it like right at the beginning before lockdown actually happened. And rewatching it was quite a different experience given what's happened even over the last 6 weeks. But in terms of the ways in which that film reflects some of the, both, I guess, like Anglocentrism and racism, or like the narratives that it, whether consciously or not, pushes, I think it's the way that Hong Kong is represented in the film is kind of crazy to me, because it's post-SARS era and they would have been so well equipped to deal with another pandemic. Like even with COVID now, they haven't even gone into like a full-on lockdown, and they're reporting the same amount of cases as us now, which is like incredible given that they're one of the most densely populated cities in the world. But I found it quite like bewildering in the film how when the World Health Organization goes to Hong Kong, they're just like these two main guys who are like irrational and emotive. They believe like everything they're reading on the internet. They're like, oh, I heard on the internet the French might have a cure. And it's kind of like, I guess it is reinforcing this idea of like the Asia region being kind of like backwards and less like developed. Like there's a complete lack of scientific presence, for example, even though they're health officials, they don't seem to have that much information. They're kind of like blundering. And so from that perspective, I think it does end up feeding into kind of the same conversations that are happening now around like the increase in hate crimes against Asian communities.
Yeah. And I think that idea of the ethnocentricity of the film is really interesting when you look at the casting, Megan. Like I was just thinking, like I am so in love with the fact that Gwyneth Paltrow is the first person that gets sick, the doyen of wellness. And I just wonder, and there are so many, I don't know, like the royal families of American cinema. And I just wonder, and the dad bod action that's in it and that sort of thing. And I just wonder if you've got any thoughts about that casting.
Yeah, Gwyneth is our patient zero. Like who was Gwyneth in 2011? This was pre-Goop, I guess. I have to say I'm not a customer of Goop, but then nor do I really know a lot about it, other than that she's become a bit of a cipher in the culture and a figure of derision at times for wanting to do such obnoxious things as consciously uncouple from Chris Martin and then, start her own successful business, which does have a strong wellness aspect and has been highly questioned. I think here she's all pre this, and she presents in the film as, a young, beautiful, blonde Aryan woman who unfortunately on a business trip, while she's having a bit of nookie, apparently, we don't see that, we just see the after effects, which are unfortunately that she's picked up this virus before she goes home to Matt Damon, who's her husband, and it all rolls on from there. I mean, for me, it's easy to be, to feel a lot of mirth around Gwyneth, but at the same time, she's a real human being, and I kind of want to resist that too. I think it is an interesting choice that it starts in Hong Kong, but it doesn't start with the person who lives there or who is from there, and that it has to start with someone who's somehow a figure of beauty and a mother, but, also a little bit naughty. So, maybe deserve to get wiped out. I don't know. There's so many ways to read it. But at the end of the day, she's not on screen for long. and she does end up having, having her head sawn open, and somehow the illness is revealed in the brain. I guess this is scientifically plausible, but I believe the script at that point, once they're looking inside her brain, is, should we tell someone? And then the next person says, tell everyone. Which also, seems kind of funny, like a precursor of Goop. But it isn't, and this is the slippery thing now, where we're reading fact through fiction and vice versa, and the cast of Contagion are being called on to give health advice in Lady Gaga's music marathon. But is there really anything so wrong with that? Especially when you look at the scientific grounding of the script. So I want to make jokes, and yet I don't.
Yeah. Oh my God. John.
I wondered if there was a bit of a strategy in that, where, to me, Megan, you mentioned she doesn't have much screen time. She dies really soon in that film, and that kind of shows how it was maybe to try and show how indiscriminate the virus in it is, that even Gwyneth gets knocked off really quickly, even
and Kate Winslet.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
I think part of that too is that there's also kind of like a credibility in the fact that people pay attention to that death, and they pay attention to like what's in her brain, and they want to tell everybody. I feel like that might not be an indiscriminate response.
Whatever it is visible to the naked eye too.
Good God. One thing that I did think when I was watching it, and couldn't help thinking when I watched it, is that one thing that feels very untrue is that in America there seems to be an infrastructure for dealing with this kind of catastrophe. Like there seems to be a very well disciplined CDC response. There's a quarantine very quickly, and yet the president is never mentioned in this movie at all. He's mentioned, but I don't know, maybe it's a woman president in this imaginary world. But I just wonder if you've got any thoughts about that, like because the response does seem relatively, apart from the looting and the killing and all that sort of thing. But yeah, does anyone have any thoughts on that? Just that idea of the infrastructure that's waiting, that perhaps wasn't waiting this time. I don't know.
Is it that they don't have the infrastructure, or more that it's just not being used or deployed in the same way as in the film? Because I found watching it the second time and having seen everything that's been happening in the States, I was just imagining that it must be such a like seductive, almost pornographic kind of like version of reality right now for anyone who's having to like not have be in a country where like that kind of infrastructure exists.
Yeah, totally.
I do have a good quote from Scott, our screenwriter for Contagion, which I think is relevant here. He said in answer to one of the questions, "I would have never thought in writing the screenplay for Contagion that one of the variables would be a government that doesn't believe in science and that misinforms the population. But that's what we have." So maybe that's why it's an absence. But yeah, it does seem quite stark, given that the government, the leadership of all countries is very focal in this situation for us all, and we're all comparing and contrasting across the media too. The stories going around about all the women leaders who've got it right. And of course, all of the appalling examples of where we haven't got it right. And I thought one thing that maybe links, well, there are several things that link all of these separate articles that we've read, from Zadie Smith to Roy's article to Vanessa's, and that's that the situation, the pandemic, is not only presenting a new situation that we're all reacting to as a globe, but it's also uncovering uncovering terrible inadequacies and injustices in our societies and the way we live. So that Roy is saying the pandemic is a portal, but let's not return to normality. And it seems to me that that's the echo, and that's another echo in Vanessa's piece too, ending on a line like, when will there be space for us, space for the Chinese as migrants? Yeah, that just seems like quite a deep, resonant echo.
Yeah, completely. One thing I am interested in, like, I think the first time we talked about this, Megan, we talked about whether it works as a film or not. And I'm just wondering, like, it's weird, it's hard to uncouple the present day experience with it. But did you find it satisfying as a film, John?
I don't know that I did, actually. I found it quite a strange film, how it, the kind of ensemble cast and the characters are kind of types rather than generally well-rounded characters, I thought. And I think parts of it, and then again, I might just back that up and say I don't even know how I could have watched it as a film right now. Because, and if I'd seen it in 2011, was it, I might have a completely different view. But I feel like watching it right now, we are only really watching for, those moments that kind of make sense in the current situation, or speak to where we are now, or might maybe give us some advice, like the gentleman Megan referred to. But yeah, so yeah, sorry, it's not really an answer, but then again, like I say, I don't think there is a kind of way to watch it right now as like any other film.
Yeah. What do you think, Rosabelle?
Well, as someone who really loves like any kind of procedural, I thought it was a really great procedural film. Like, I love seeing how public health infrastructure might respond to a pandemic. So I thought from that perspective, like, the science is super strong. Well, like, obviously, because they worked with these two, oh no, I can't say the word, epidemiologists.
Yeah, it's a tough word.
So from that perspective, I thought it was like I find it so satisfying to watch competency.
Yeah, there's a lot of great competency in here. Yeah, and like just risks taken that pay off and stuff as well. What about you, Megan? Like, I think we've talked about how you're not, I don't know. Anyway, what do you think? Does it work as a film?
Well, I think when I first watched it, I had the impression that I was carrying, and I was carrying this impression with me, that it didn't work and that it must have been some form of a mild flop or something. And I guess I agree with John ultimately. Now it's hard to watch it as a film, as a story. It seems more like a variable, and the ensemble cast does enable the virus to travel, which is of course what viruses do, as we know so well right now. Yet when I've gone back combing through reviews, I've realized that it wasn't actually badly reviewed. Apparently it was moderately successful, and one reviewer said it had a sinuous urgency. And then I thought, well, maybe it does have a sinuous urgency, I thought to myself. So and the fact that people have been able to reactivate it and even pay to stream it online, I think it obviously has, a currency, for want of another word. Yet I think it doesn't really arc emotionally. Like, it has a relationship to Matt Damon, who's a beginning character and an end character. It expends with various characters quite freely, like Kate Winslet and she certainly did nothing wrong in the context of Contagion. She came, she did the exposition on the whiteboard about the, rate of reproduction for the virus. She set up a hospital, and then she kindly just lay down and died in it. whereas other characters like Lawrence Fishburne last throughout. And there are moments where it plugs into class, like a cleaner who's working in that building with Lawrence Fishburne, who seems to represent the head of contagious diseases or some organization in lieu of a president or someone, you know, taking these meetings to the media. He is that figure. So there are some little moments there where it's talking about the inequality that is sweeping through how the fictional virus is playing out. But all of these articles that we look at, and the Roy and the Zadie Smith's American Exception, they hit that really hard. And I guess that's been one of the dichotomies that we see come through our screens, our stories at the moment, from we're all in this together and the countless Zooms many of us have been in, not all of us, or that we've seen, or just the presentations of celebrities in their homes, anyone in their homes, we're all in this together, you know, together in art, together as one. And then this other reality, this jolt. No, we're not all experiencing this in the same way. How can we be?
And I think that thought about you know, that sort of touching into the inequality stuff, I think leads us quite nicely onto Camus' The Plague. Like, I feel like this is a book about, like, John, you wrote so eloquently about this, like this idea of, you know, it is a book that tells us how to feel in a way that maybe Contagion doesn't so much tell us how to feel. You know, it feels like The Plague, I mean, you know, it feels like an experiential book, you know, and I just wonder, like, you, in your article, and I think it's quite well known, that really the novel is an allegory, you know, that the disease kind of stands for Camus' sort of firsthand. I'm reading this and I'm trying to make it look like I'm not reading it. It's from your article. But, you know, I think what you say is that the disease stands for something he did know firsthand, the German occupation of France. And I'm just wondering about this oddness, you know, having been written as allegory, but us reading it more as, you know, I don't know what you'd call it, more straight to straight. And I'm just wondering about this comparison of the pandemic to war. And yeah, could you just maybe talk a little bit more about the sort of like how the book may have worked in 1947 compared with how it might work now?
Yeah, it's really interesting. And if people have it, the Penguin one has a really great introduction that talks about this, and kind of gives a lot of that context. It's interesting, like your early question too about, you know, looking to stories, and there's kind of an irony, I guess, in that Camus is, we're looking at the plague now to see what might come next, but he was using it to look at something that had happened already, and as a way to kind of understand an event in the past that wasn't a plague. But the war comparison in Zadie Smith's essay and the Arundhati Roy essay talk about this too, don't they? And I think Jacinda Ardern made the comparison the other day in her talk, and certainly Trump and Boris Johnson have used it quite a lot. And when I hear people like Trump and Boris Johnson use it as an analogy for plague, I think it's a really terrible one, because you can kind of see why they're using it, which is to kind of position themselves as heroic figures. But what Camus, what I think this book does is uses this plague to kind of broaden our understanding of the war and what that event had been like, and I guess by extension any kind of like massive event that impacts a lot of people, you know, where it's not about heroic figures and it's not about that kind of, you know, there's no kind of leader in that either, actually. Like you said with Contagion, it's just kind of people working very diligently to get through something, and also people not working, people who are just trying to get by or survive, or even people who there's a guy who tries to profit from it, as there is in Contagion, actually. That there's everyone just has to respond to it in their way, and he's not very judgmental about that. He just kind of he seems to be just reflecting on that. That's all we have. These are the only options. The only option we have is to respond, and he doesn't really cast judgment on what that response might look like. It's I think in the introduction to it too refers to people at the time feeling like it wasn't a very good comparison, because the plague is a kind of nameless, faceless thing, whereas the war, there was a real enemy. But I think again, that's what makes it interesting when he uses it, because it makes us rethink war is not something that most people are just impacted by it without any having that feeling of agency, or whether there is an enemy or not.
Can I just hit on one character in particular? Like the character, I can't remember how to pronounce his name, but he's the person who was very depressed and absolutely desolate before the plague, and then when the plague comes, he actually his spirits rise because he feels like everybody else is as sad as he. That's the way I read it, that there was this sort of group depression or something. And I'm just wondering, could you talk just a little bit about him, because I'm just obsessed with him.
So I think that's the character, and I was hoping, with all the names in this book, I was hoping someone else would say them before I had to. I think it's Kotar would be his name.
That's him.
And so he, as you say, he is, it's an interesting one. And he is, I guess it's okay to tell people what happens in this book, that he's the one that kind of tries to profit from the plague. And I guess it's seeing that he's like an analogy with the people who collaborated with the Nazis in World War II. And it's quite oddly non-judgmental of him, even though he does that. It just, I guess, reflects on the fact that that's how he felt he had to respond, and none of the characters that kind of analyzes in that way. He and ultimately at the end, he's kind of turned on by other people who like a lot of those collaborators in World War II were. There's also something interesting there too, where the other characters are kind of aware he's doing that and they don't try to stop him or tell him off or anything. They just tell him to kind of try and keep him, stay out of trouble, or not make it known to the authorities.
And I do wonder if this non-judgmentality, I don't even know if that's a word, but Rosabelle, I was wondering about this idea, and I actually wrote this question to you before I realized who the narrator was, but I'm just wondering, like, I was thinking a little bit about your writing. I was just thinking about some writing that you did during your masters, which I absolutely adored, and just this idea of where the narrator is placed in a story like this. And I just wonder, do you have any thoughts on that at all?
I actually only finished the book this morning, and you should have heard me gasp when I got to the last chapter. I found it a super unusual narrative method. I can't really think of another novel that uses that in the same way. And I think, John, you kind of write about it as well. I wrote down the quote, but I don't know if I'll be able to find it. Just about how, like, the survivors become changed through the experience of the plague, and through that experience discover aspects of themselves that they might not have discovered before. And I guess, like, I was thinking about it because I think it's kind of essential to have a narrator who is not a character, because the whole idea is that the plague could befall anybody. So if you have a narrator who you know is someone in that world, you kind of can mark them as safe probably. So I think there's like that aspect of it. But then at the end, when he's talking about how it was important to like be a honest witness, so that was interesting, because obviously like no narrator is ever truly objective. Like on a very basic level, we follow like 5 dudes through the city and we don't really see anyone else except for like his mom and like 2 long distance girlfriends. So that's like a very specific pocket of the city. But I'm being a bit facetious, but I think what it does do is it kind of like opens up space to talk about responsibility, or like the roles that people might have, or the opportunity that people can have when they experience any kind of like shared trauma like this. Because really he's writing this novel, like the narrator is writing this novel from the perspective of having gone through it and being changed by it and trying to reflect back on it. And so from that perspective, I think it makes it quite an interesting, like it kind of shifts the gravity for you as a reader, because then you kind of like go back and think about all that stuff too.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible. It's pretty bloody impressive, really. I thought I'd just say, I don't know if anyone is watching live. I have no idea. We may all just be talking to ourselves, which is very nice. And we are going to be able to, I think, broadcast this this conversation on Radioactive, which is really great as well. But if you are watching and you have a question, maybe you would like to type it in the comments section, and then someone will text it to me and I can put it to the panelists. So I'll just put that out there. Megan, as sort of a segue between sort of reading The Plague and into sort of a broader conversation about what it is to consume art at this time, I'm wondering, what is it to read a book like this at the moment, or to consume, you know, to watch Contagion, or, you know, can you talk a little bit about that? You know, what, you know, how is it to read a book like The Plague in lockdown, or other sorts of books like that?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about that, but why not? Yeah.
Thanks, Megan. It'd be a really short book.
I think it's, I've read The Plague towards the end of lockdown, and I think I'm glad I've read it towards the end. Like, I don't know how it would have been to watch Contagion and to read The Plague if I was in London right now, or if I was in New York, or if I don't know. But having said that, you know, experiencing it as news, as a reality, although it hasn't hit our country in quite the same way as others at this particular point. And then reading The Plague, a book like this, which is a classic, and for good reason. It's kind of a cold comfort. It's kind of this huge booster shot of everything that art and humanity can do, and the biggest questions that can be asked. And the narration has quite a kind of civic, rational, reasonable tone throughout, so that it's not like a zombie movie all the time that's kind of opening a cupboard and going ah! and showing you something completely diabolical, and yet it is doing that all the time. Yeah, so I feel very conflicted, yet again and again on every page I read something that really chimes with me. You know, he started this book when he was 28, published a few years later in 1947. I mean, the occupation of France, the Nazi occupation of France, has been a common reading of the book, but it's not necessarily the reading. I must say, any comparisons to that completely went over the top of my head until I read some articles about The Plague. I read it purely as The Plague, as though I was reading a scientific drill sheet of what might happen with The Plague, and it worked very well in that capacity alone. I mean, even just here, this little quote: Why should they have thought about the plague, which negates the future, negates journeys and debate? I mean, this is from the beginning, obviously. I suppose in my own way, in lockdown these past few weeks, yeah, it has, especially at the beginning, it did feel like the future was definitely pressed pause on or negated, even just venturing further and further away from my bubble these last few days under alert level 3. It's been weird to think of the future still unfolding. And because I have loved ones and dear friends in London, I knew Contagion was the right choice for book club when I contacted my best friend from art school, and he said, I just watched Contagion last night. He lives in London and Brixton, and he was like, don't watch it unless you're, prepared to have some real nightmares. And I think it had really resonated with him and his current reality too. Whilst it can be disquieting, it can also be, I don't know, comfort's the wrong word, but really sustaining to look at these things at this time as well. And to find resonance in them, and to think about the questions we're being asked and what we are being witness to. And we are witness to what is happening. There's an incredible article a colleague forwarded to me by Jacqueline Rose on London Review of Books on the plague, and she really makes some stark comparisons in that, like Boris Johnson's hospital experience compared to a long-term NHS nurse, how do I get that out of my mouth, who dies at home being told not to go into the hospital. I mean, there are some formidable and shocking things happening. And even watching that music lineup of Lady Gaga's, it had quite a lot of episodes of different people speaking, from the World Health Organization to all sorts of people on the front line. There's that war comparison again, etc. And at times I felt really touched and moved, and I just wondered if I was becoming some huge, ridiculous creature, like moved to tears, like thinking about the food banks and the lines in America, and a woman who's a waitress. I waitressed for a long time when I was younger, a waitress with 4 kids in line for the food bank. And the impact of what has happened and what is happening is massive in so many ways.
Yeah, totally. I was going to ask another question, but there's just a really good question has just come through, and I wonder if you all would be willing to answer it. So someone has asked, a few months on, when the panelists are thinking about their next work, how hard will it be not to be inspired by these COVID times? Is it possible to not be inspired or influenced by them? And I mean, yeah, like we, how do you feel about that? Like, John, maybe, have you got any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting because a lot of people are writing about this, obviously. I had the experience where I kind of decided that I wouldn't do that. And then I kind of promptly went and did write something. So I don't know, I just felt like this was, the thing about a shared event is you don't feel like you've got anything new to say because everyone knows it. Everyone's going through the same thing. So I kind of felt that way. And one day I walked down to the shops and I was just kind of blown away. Just that experience just kind of blew me away. In that every person I passed, I could hear them talking about it. And this is prior to the lockdown. And then turning on the radio, the news on the radio was about it. Looking on the computer, everything was about it. And I'd kind of, you see that in movies like Contagion, but I didn't actually think it would be like that. I thought people would still talk about sports or whatever. And so I just kind of came home and wrote that down. And that's the kind of first paragraph of the piece of mine you referred to. And then I kind of went from there and wrote the rest of it. And then that done, I really don't see, I'll probably break this again, but I really feel like I don't want to write anything more about it. That having I'm kind of sick of it, and I would like to think about other topics.
Well, you came to the wrong book club.
Yeah. This event excluded, obviously. We're talking about the plague, and yeah. So that's kind of my feeling on it. That you know, I feel a little that way about reading more about it. Like I'm kind of, you know, you kind of, it peaks and troughs your interest in reading things about it. I feel like, yeah, but I'm interested to hear how others response to this one.
I'm particularly interested, Rosabelle, about moving forward with satellites. You know, like it's such a often intimate, often close, you know, the projects. Yeah, I mean, it's too soon to think about it, but I do wonder if, you know, if this is something that you have been thinking about.
Yeah, I've been thinking about it heaps. And actually, I hated reading The Plague. It was like torturous. But I think it's just about where my head's at the moment. And in the same way, like, I don't think the work that satellites will be making in the future will be about the pandemic or about COVID. But I think it will be impossible not to be responding to the impact of this time and how it changes the way we live, and also how it could change the way we live. Because I think I was thinking about how in Singapore they call the lockdown, they probably call this in a lot of countries, but they are calling it the circuit breaker. And I quite like that as like a mark of like, yes, it's like a change in the way we live, and it could be a change in how we live in the future. And yeah, a lot of the other writers that we've been reading touched on that as well. I guess for me, like one of the big things, which you kind of allude to, Pip, is like the way in which how we think about intimacy will change. And I think it will change quite a lot, especially like in the short to medium term, especially as someone who like works in public space where people are untraceable. Like that's really hard. But also I think I've been thinking a lot about like the way in which I guess there are two other things that I've been thinking about, and one is like the way that we have always privileged physical interaction. Like even when we're like Zooming people now, it's like, oh, can't wait to like see you properly. But I think there's like a lot of work that's starting to be developed and starting to come out that's really interesting, where it's like it creates intimacy online in these really unique ways. And then the other thing, I guess, is we are like super advanced in this like flattening the curve, or like the pandemic journey, if we're going to call it that. I don't know if we will, but you know, like the borders are going to be closed for a really long time around the world. But then at the same time, there's like this interesting flattening of borders online. I don't know. I've found this in particular, like I'm having a lot of conversations with people internationally that I usually wouldn't. And I think it's kind of like there's something in that, in the way people might work together in the future. So those are the kinds of thoughts that I'm thinking about. But in terms of actual work, I don't know at this point.
And Megan, I know that I really love your provocation for this thing about reading the pandemic. But I also wonder about this. It's an interesting question that this person's posed, you know, about writing the pandemic as well. And I just wonder, I mean, no one's had time to think really, but I just wonder, have you got any thoughts about that?
Well, you know, when it first happened, suddenly one day the phrase "my corona" dropped into my head to the sound of "my Sharona," because, you know, all of the articles and think pieces started coming out. And yeah, I think at the moment it seems like, how can you address it? How can you not address it? Like it permeates everything right now. How can it be off the table, and yet how can I, Megan Dunn, say anything remotely meaningful or contribute from my particular rather remote so far, touch laminate table personal experience of it. My big answer to that, I don't know. I just don't know. I think we'll see a lot of art from this time. Will it directly address it? Will it be taken for an allegory of something else? Who's to say? Some of it's already unfolding. Some of it's already here, and some of it's just beginning. And it will be interesting. I have no doubt sometimes it will be boring. And that will change depending on the person encountering it. From my own perspective, at the start of this, when we went into lockdown, I was looking at the stats daily, every 15 minutes, at a much higher rate, and reading every news article indiscriminately, almost avidly. And as things have gone on, that has subsided, although I can move in and out of that at different points. And one thing I did notice with this Jacqueline Rose article that came into my inbox only a few days ago, she was like, why are we looking at these graphs? I mean, much more eloquent than this. Why are we looking at them in the numbers, except that we can't get a grip on this? And then I was thinking, what am I looking for? I suppose I'm looking for the flattening of the curve, for something subsiding, for the idea of control. Is this under control, So I think what I've been engaged with has switched between that early phase of graphs and Susie Wiles and various, Spin-Off and Newsroom are the sites I've gone to for news, often the briefings, of course. And then I've gone to Tom Sainsbury videos, and I found that actually fantastic. And that has offered a very, very robust portrait of New Zealand in lockdown. Yeah.
And I think that's where we're getting slowly towards the end of our event. And I did want to just sort of go around the circle, like maybe Rosabelle, if you could start just talking about what art have we, not finding soulless, maybe, is that the right word? But, not finding peace or calmness in perhaps, but just the art that you've found yourself consuming during this time. Like, I was thinking, I've been really enjoying The Plot Against America, and I don't know why. I think I like Winona Ryder a lot. But yeah, I found myself going to the oddest things. Like I rewatched Community from start to finish. I'm really enjoying the NBA documentary, The Last Dance. Yeah, I'm really surprised where I'm going. But yeah, I just wonder, do you want to list some interesting things? I don't know. An interesting list.
I don't know if it'll be an interesting list. It'll probably be a revealing list. But I feel like I couldn't bear to face any art for the first month. Like the whole time we were in level 4, I was like, everyone was like checking stuff online, and I just couldn't even be the thought of tuning into anything. I did rewatch all of Pretty Little Liars, which is just so embarrassing to admit, but I love it. And I did read someone was saying about how rewatching TV shows in particular, where you've obviously seen it before, is very calming because you already know how it's going to end. And so it's giving yourself a sense of certainty in uncertain times. But what I've really been enjoying lately is the show called Dave, which is a comedy. Do you guys know it?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, it is so good. I recommend it to everyone. It's little I don't know if you'd call it a sitcom, but it's a series about this real life Jewish rapper, Lil Dicky, and it's just hilarious. It's my main thing. Yep.
Awesome. What about you, John? Have you been reading, or what have you been up to?
I think this is probably when someone should mention Tiger King.
Yes, let's mention that.
And I'm going to be that person to say I watched that early on in this, after reading the plague, I then went and watched that. And I was thinking about that before this event, and thinking how I wasn't that interested in it, or didn't really want to. I just kind of watched it because it was there and people were talking about it, and I feel like that's probably not uncommon in experience, and how important it was to watch something that other people were watching, that people were talking about, so you could then talk with them about it. And our viewing habits and reading habits have kind of get more and more like fractured or whatever over the years, and particularly viewing habits, I'd say, with Netflix and subscription services rather than broadcast. And it was like a kind of step back towards that broadcast model where people will watch something and talk about it the next day. I felt like a show like that everyone seemed to have an opinion on, or you just heard constant reference to it for a while there.
And I don't know. I feel like we can't go past the Tiger King without talking to you, Rosabelle. But I don't know how much of your you would like to share about the Tiger King.
I have still not watched it, and
good.
Megan and John, I don't know if you know, but I've been like very heavily bullied in my flat for not watching it, to the point where there was like a video that one of the, I don't even know who, I've forgotten his name now, but he's from the Tiger King, and he filmed a personal message to tell me to watch Tiger King. Yeah, I can send you the video. It was, wow. But I'm resolute now. I will never do it.
That made you firmer in not watching it?
Yeah, I didn't really want to watch it in the first place, but now it's like the principle of the thing.
Yeah. I feel like that has been a big part of my culture, has been watching Instagram and watching your flatmates increasing stakes and trying to get you to watch. Sorry, that sounds a bit stalkerish, but yeah, it's just wonderful. What about you, Megan? What have you been? Do you want to finish us off and tell us anything about what you've been watching?
Gosh, I've got to say I'm completely blank. I've done this. I've done this. I've read The Orchid Thief finally, after watching adaptation years ago and always being very interested in it. And the combination of people in daft pursuit of orchids in Florida has been really, really interesting to me. And I've read that in small doses. I have not watch Tiger King, but I feel like it's a symbol. It's like a missing link or symbol of this time. And I also note that apparently Nicolas Cage is going to play Tiger King. Okay, that's not fake news. I didn't make that up. Yeah, so that's happened too. But that piques my interest, because I feel like I might not watch Tiger King, but I probably will watch Nicolas Cage play Tiger King.
Same.
I don't know what.
I feel like The Orchid Thief is a similar kind of similar DNA to the Tiger King, actually.
John, you're opening up a whole new can of worms.
This is the next book club, maybe.
You heard it here, Orchid King. After you've seen Orchid King, there we go. We've had some amazing comments come through on the comments. I'm sorry I couldn't get to everybody's questions, but yeah, there's some great stuff coming through, and thank you so much to the people who watched live. I really appreciate it, and thanks so much to John and Megan and Rosabelle. Megan is just the most. Thank you for all your work on this, Megan, as well as agreeing to be a panelist, and thanks to everybody for your wonderfulness. And I am now going to hand over to Megan to close up for us, and then I will stop the live stream.
Okay. Thank you, Pip, Rosabelle, and John. And hopefully this time I can do this without reverb, which I think I got wrong on my meaningful beginning. But City Gallery Wellington, of course, we look forward to welcoming you again in person soon. Watch our website for details of our reopening. This is the end of lockdown at Alert Level 3 very soon. And this is the end of this book club tonight in Zoom. But crucially, this is not the end. This is not the end of coronavirus. And I'll part with quite an oblique quote from the plague, but one I like. It is in the thick of calamity that one gets hardened to the truth. In other words, to silence. Stay well, stay safe,